Straight ahead, we explore Black participation in the politics of Louisiana, from PBS Pinchback to now on today's Pause for Pride. Then a glimpse of a fascinating exhibit by two Black photographers at the New Orleans Museum of Art, all in today's edition of Folks. Hello everyone and welcome to Folks. I'm Sonya Masingale. In the past 30 years, Black Americans have made enormous progress socially and economically. This progress is mostly due to the right to vote. Much of the foundation for the civil rights movement and for the progress of Black Americans was laid right after the Civil War during the Reconstruction era. Louisiana has always had a colorful political climate, and Reconstruction Louisiana was no exception. Louisiana was home of the first and only Black governor in the United States. Until the election of Governor Douglas Wilder of Virginia, Pinckney Benton Stewart Pinchback was the only Black in America to serve as governor. Although he only served a short time, we find today that his contribution was significant and lasting. Emancipation. One can only imagine what was on the hearts and minds of all Americans. For Black Americans, there was undoubtedly relief, fear, uncertainty, and pride.
It was obviously an unusual time. The war had wreaked havoc and disarray within the social, economic, and political system of the South. It was a very devastating war because obviously the South had to be conquered militarily. The North was totally on the offensive. They had to bring the South to its knees. So there was a lot of disarray after the war. Now, in order to build that back up, there were many proposals put forth, both by President Abraham Lincoln and later by the congressional leaders. And Lincoln's plans after his assassination was not accepted by the congressional leaders. The plans of Andrew Johnson were also rejected by the congressional leaders. So Congress attempted to remake the South in kind of the North's image. Now, a very sinister statement could be made in that Northern Republicans were interested in trying to make Southerners treat blacks fairly, not to have them migrate to the North, you see. And also the Republican Party wanted to build a Republican Party based on their most loyal voters, who were the black voters, okay? So as a trade-off, the Republicans in Congress was willing to offer chances and opportunities for blacks to rise to the surface, to become political voters and leaders in return for their support in the Republican Party and remaining within the party. So it was a time when there was a lot of fluid, as some authors have said. The society was kind of fluid, and there were movements and changes within the society.
The Reconstruction years following emancipation were chaotic and brief according to all accounts. These years laid the foundation for the Civil Rights era and changed the political structure of America for all time.
The national political leaders, quote unquote, the radicals in Congress, were the individuals most instrumental in trying to remake the South over. And in remaking the South, there was an effort to try to find a place for blacks to be a vital part of the political scene. And this gave rise to blacks as voters and as elected officials. These were individuals who were shrewd, many had education, many had been free before the Civil War. Individuals who, under the very extraneous circumstances, had achieved some degree of success. They may be a successful carpenter, a successful farmer. Some were educators. Some had traveled abroad to get their education. So they were really individuals who had taken advantage of every progressive opportunity available to them and made the most of it. their education ranged from some who had just been taught how to read and write as a result of serving in the Civil War, to some who, as I've said, had served and, excuse me, had actually got an education abroad in Europe.
It's obvious to anyone who knows anything about history that these gentlemen did not walk off of a cotton plantation and into a suit and into the Louisiana Legislature. So where did they come from, and who were they?
Oscar James Dunn was the delegate to the Constituent Convention, a delegate to the Constituent Convention of 1867-68, as well as the first lieutenant governor for the state of Louisiana, the first black lieutenant governor, elected in April of 1868 to serve in that post as lieutenant governor, and served roughly about 2.5 years before his untimely death. Dunn was a man whose political opponents said was incorruptible, a very honest, honorable man who offered programs and policies and solutions and resolutions that were designed to move the entire state of Louisiana forward. PBS Pinchback probably is the one who has gained the most ink of all of the Reconstruction figures in Louisiana. Pinchback was also a delegate to the Constituent Convention of 1867-68, as well as a state senator, and then lieutenant governor and governor for roughly about 42 days, I believe. And from there, he went on to be elected to a national office, although he was not permitted to serve. Pinchback was the son of a white planter and a slave mother. He was born in Georgia as his father moved his mother and his other brothers and sisters from Virginia to the state of Louisiana. Pinchback was born during that transition period in Macon, Georgia, around 1837. And after his father resettled in Holmes County, Mississippi, and sent Pinchback, PBS, and his other brother, Napoleon, to Ohio for an education. As teenagers, their parents, his father rather, died, and hence he has just a mother who has to leave the state of Mississippi because her in-laws would like to sell PBS and his brother perhaps back into slavery. So they have to escape and go back to Ohio, where as a teenager, Pinchback has to take a job to support the family. And it was on boats that traveled the Mississippi and the Red River that he gained additional education and made him certainly a man that could reckon well in today's politics in Louisiana or any other state. So he was a very shrewd individual who had learned on the job, and he had had some book learning, as we would say, and also, when the Civil War began, was an officer in the Civil War.
What impact did these first black politicians have on politics in Louisiana and in America as a whole?
They had a tremendous impact. In that, we will find that the long range or the long-term impact would be that there would be great fear of black voters. Okay? The long-term impact is that blacks remain with the Republican Party for the next 50-plus years, up until the Depression years. Also, after blacks were out of office, the Negro question, or the black question, became a good scapegoat and a good whipping horse for politicians who would come to always hold this up as something that they never wanted to occur again. Okay? Positively, some of the things were that it was during Reconstruction that a genuine effort to improve the educational system of southern states were put into place. Secondly, civil rights legislation were on the lips and on the minds of many state legislators, so we had some of our first civil rights legislation put into place. Thirdly, the state's concern for its less fortunate in society was given a boost. That is, the deaf, the dumb, the insane asylums received genuine support, you see. So there were positive gains. The state lending its name to credit, to bring in industry, was something that they talked about, both black and white legislators. So when you look at what they were trying to do, and when you look at the current scene, they were more progressive than many of the men who served prior to their serving and those who came into office shortly after Reconstruction. What happened to these men is a sad commentary on the history of this nation and certainly this state. Many of them were killed, not many, but some were killed. Most endured social ostracism and economic oppression. Thirdly, they also had to leave the state, those that remain in politics, or leave the areas where they were active in politics and go to other areas of the country or of the state to survive. So it caused, during the counter-revolution, it caused, I guess, individuals who want to use any legal or extra-legal, and they were mostly extra-legal means, illegal, violent means to get them out of power. This came to the forefront. There were many terrorist organizations, the White Leaguers, the Ku Klux Klans, the Knights of the White Camellias, and other similar groups operating in the state to use scare tactics and even violence to make sure that these men remained in fear of their life. And many gave up on the states of the South and left. In Louisiana, for example, PBS Pinchback moved eventually to Washington, D.C. T.T. Elaine, another leader, ended up moving to Chicago. Henry Demas, who represented very well St. John the Baptist Parish as a representative, and later that senatorial district, had to move to New Orleans, you see. In Mississippi, Manuel Handy had to leave Copiah County and move to Kansas, you see. So many black politicians throughout the South, and including Louisiana, left in what was called the Great Exodus of the 1870s and later in the 1880s, when politics were obviously a area of life that they were not invited or welcomed to participate in. And on the heels of that, you have some of our most restrictive segregation laws emerging in the 1890s and at the turn of the century. And many techniques were utilized to keep them from voting, such as the grandfather clause and the poll tax and other extra-legal means to get them out of office and to prevent their serving as voters and as office holders.
So the stars of the short period of Reconstruction politics faded to the tune of the violent counter-revolution. But black political progress did not stop there. Though they were denied voting rights in many areas, African Americans found ways to progress. The next 100 years saw the contributions of Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, the Harlem Renaissance, and the Civil Rights Movement. However, it wasn't until 1967, almost 100 years after Reconstruction, that another black representative served in the Louisiana State Legislature. That man was Ernest Dutch Morial, who went on to become the first black mayor of the city of New Orleans.
There were some blacks voting, but the numbers were in fact very, very small. Louisiana, like most southern states, were such that blacks did not take an active role in the political process. In fact, while Huey Long gets a lot of the credit for creating a political climate which made it possible for blacks to have a more expanded role, it was actually his brother Earl Long which did more, much more than Huey Long, to help increase the number of black voters. So it was only at that time you got a significant increase in the number of black voters, but those numbers were still very small, certainly not to the level of blacks having any chance to elect someone to go to the state legislature.
Ernest Morial's presence in the Louisiana legislature served blacks in Louisiana more symbolically than in actual policy changes. However, after Morial's election, it was just a short time before blacks began to be elected to the House and then the Senate from around the state.
Well, the presence was more of a symbolic nature rather than a substantive nature or an impact on policy, because obviously, as you know, he was only one black legislator. So there was very little that he could do in terms of passing policies that he would want to see passed that would be favorable to the interest of black people. But symbolism in American politics is extremely important. And the fact that he was the first black member of the House since Reconstruction said a lot. It said that Southern politics, that Louisiana politics, was on the threshold of change, and very positive change, and that the politics that had been practiced prior to that time pretty much was over, and that we're going to have a new day from a political standpoint. So in many ways, the election of Dutch Morial, in my view, effectively summarizes or symbolizes all the positive change politically that has transpired in this state and in certain cities in this state since the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Contrary to his popular perception, he was not a person which talked about his accomplishments much. He wanted to talk more about the nature of blacks' involvement in the political process and how blacks could maximize the kinds of benefits that they could get from the political process. So in terms of our conversation, though, it focused more on his mayoral career as opposed to what happened prior to that time. And one of the things, though, that he said to me, which I think gets to one of the major concerns of politics, as we move from symbolic politics to a substantive nature, he told me that one of the things that he has found that black leaders and black groups play a very important role in helping preferred candidates get elected to office. And he was only talking about himself, he was talking generally. And he said that one of the problems that he has found, once the election is over with, those black leaders and those black groups do not come and say, this is what I expect. In other words, the lobbying component of black politics he found to be limited. And I found that surprising as well.
During the late 60s and throughout most of the 70s, the Black Caucus of the Louisiana Legislature became one of the most effective arms of state government, even to the election of Baton Rouge Representative Joe Delpit as Speaker Pro Tem of the Louisiana House.
Blacks who are elected to a legislative body feels that given the nature of the legislative process, it is important to maximize their input and their impact by acting from a collective standpoint. So rather than having 12 or 15 or 20 black legislators following a separate course and voting sort of as an individual unit, you'll find that at least they thought that it'd be in their better interest to look at public policy proposals, to study how those public policy proposals impact on blacks, and decide how they should vote, and vote as a collective body. So the reason as to why you get a black caucus is to maximize the influence that a small number of black legislators will have on the legislative process.
Most of the legislators with whom I've spoken throughout the United States are appalled at how successful, for example, the Louisiana Legislative Black Caucus has been in the scheme of political things in this state. To have a black speaker pro tem with 14 members out of 105 is in itself, in my judgment, an attestation to the political prowess of the black community, and how well the communities are working with each other.
You've mentioned symbolism in connection to black participation in the political process in Louisiana. Why is symbolism so important?
Symbolism is important for a number of reasons. The first of which is in terms of blacks' relationship to the political system. It sort of helps to structure the perception that blacks have about the political system and the perception of how blacks feel the political system feel toward them. So symbolism, I think, associated with having a black elected to a high-level position in government, sends the kind of message which says that the political system is open to black Americans and it's possible for Black Americans to get elected to office and work for positive social change. Now, here is where symbolism helps to achieve substantive ends, because if Blacks' perception of the political process and the extent of its openness is favorable, then that encourages Blacks to be more actively involved.
Is it enough to vote?
Of course not. Voting is the most basic element. It is an important element in the democratic political system, to be sure about that. But it is, in many ways, the simplest and the most basic element. If a group is to be successful in politics, a group has to go much beyond voting. In terms of taking part in campaign activities, for instance, in terms of lobbying public officials. Remember my comment about what Mayor Morial said earlier, that's one of the principal weaknesses that he's found in the structure of Black politics. They help candidates get elected, but don't do enough in terms of follow-up to extract benefits from politicians in exchange for their vote. So to answer your question, voting is not enough, but it's interesting that you asked that, because one of the things that we found is that in terms of the higher level components of politics, campaign activities and cooperative activities, and by that I mean groups of people working together to help solve local problems, Blacks are extremely active in those two forms, and indeed are more active than white citizens. So and I think this points to the extent to which Blacks have really bought into the political process. They're of course active in voting, but that's not the area where they're most active. They are active in two of the higher forms of political actions that we have, and that is surprising for this reason. Several prior studies in the 1970s indicated that we should expect Blacks to be not actively involved in politics because of their generally low socioeconomic status. But all studies that have been done in the 1980s have shown that that's not to be the case at all. That Blacks are extremely active despite their low socioeconomic status. So voting is not enough.
What's in the political future for Louisiana's Black population?
You are likely to see, in terms of the South, in terms of the nation in general, Blacks achieving some electoral victories that one would have never thought possible 15, 20 years ago. And I think the reason for that is in many ways a simple one. As Blacks are routinely elected to public office, and as white citizens become more comfortable seeing Blacks as city council members and as mayors, etc., I think that whites will, as a result, feel more comfortable in voting for Blacks at very high levels of government. The election of Doug Wilder does not surprise me at all. And I think you're likely to see that those kinds of political breakthroughs happening in other southern states. I just throw out that Andrew Young is running for governor of Georgia. I wouldn't predict that he's going to win, but I predict that he stands a very good chance of winning. Now, I think the next level for Black politics in this state, the most immediate level, is to get a Black member of the Congress. And of course, the only district where that is likely to happen at is the district that's currently being held by Congresswoman Lindy Boggs. So whenever Congressman Boggs steps down, I think that you're likely to see the first Black congressman from this state elected.
Now, next week, we'll continue our discussion of Black participation in the political process in Louisiana. Be sure to join us for a lively and spontaneous discussion. Our final feature for today introduces us to the work of two young Black photographers, Keith Calhoun and Chandra McCormick. Born by the River, a work in progress, is an attempt to document a dying culture. In particular, it portrays black longshoremen of the wharfs along the Mississippi River and the lives of sugarcane workers in the southern part of the state. Today, we share with you the vision of this vanishing way of life captured forever through the lens of Calhoun and McCormick. Well, that's all for today's program. Be sure to join us next week as we further discuss Black participation in the politics of Louisiana. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.